Of course. So this could be an extension of the bubble.
This is a bigger bubble.
Well, I think it's wonderful to create a book club in Trevignano.
This is the bubble.
No, also because what I was thinking was, in case of an eventual lockdown, in case there is, it's very nice to know that you have a sense of community. And I feel like with Deanna, I would have no problem calling
We
her.
are absolutely in agreement.
Yeah, and also, you know, so I thought, let's just, and with Deanna, for example, things like chatting.
She doesn't bite. Non morde, non morde. Abbiamo nipotini.
No, ma ce l'abbiamo pure noi, il cane, quindi non è problema.
No, no more.
So we're going to get into your time, but do you have anything to add? Okay, so it's up to you now. The first author from the Reflections from a Roman Night. Would you like your book?
Ciao.
Do you want her to read from the
I'm going to introduce you. We want to explain why this all came about. Some years ago, 4 years ago, I happened to hear a lecture by an archaeologist who had worked underwater in the lake here. And what was so fascinating was that he had to go dive under 5 meters of water, 3 meters of mud, and they discovered by pure chance a Neolithic village, which it turns out is the largest Neolithic village known in Europe. Because there must have been an earthquake, because the land created a mudslide that covered it just as Pompeii was covered. And I had written a book about Pompeii. Well, this is a Neolithic Pompeii. It's exactly the same thing because it was covered almost overnight. They found only one body there of a 15-year-old boy. But I got so excited about it. Number one, I organized a talk here that he gave. And then I became friends with another archaeologist who had worked underwater. Can you imagine? They couldn't use fins because the fins would stir up the mud. So they had to work 3 months at the beginning of every summer, from April to June, just to clear the mud so that they could make a channel, which they carefully marked. Well, I got so excited about this that I became friends with the curator of the Figurini Museum, which has something like 100,000 artifacts that they found underwater. Now, these included an opium pipe. It included food. It included pieces of sail for the boats, and they found 5 boats. And the boats are in the museum at the Figurini. 3 of them are anyway.
Wow.
So
they were taken from here?
Yes, they were taken from there, 10 meters long, 10 meters long. And they traveled, they found a little goddess, this big, of steatite. And it seems to have come from Macedonia, so they assumed that they brought that goddess from Macedonia, but they also brought seeds. Because up until now, here, they had only been hunting, you know. And so it created the first stable village. It was the predecessor of Trevignano. And I compared Trevignano.
Inside the lake.
It was under the lake.
Yes.
This
now
brought
it's under the
farming and a residential community here for the first time ever. It was no longer hunting and gathering for the first time. The Neolithic Revolution is fascinating. And this was all from 5,800 BC to 5,300 BC, when the presumed quake came and buried it. And so I happened to have come here by chance, and I called this village the Black Swan because it was a thing that almost didn't exist. And a black swan is very unusual. People thought it didn't exist at all, but they did. And now we pass to you and a little excerpt number 1.
Excerpt number 1, okay.
Fascinating.
Yes, absolutely.
My goodness.
Can I take off my mask or not?
Yes, for me, yes.
Okay, this is the first chapter, an excerpt from the first chapter. The 4 black swans arrived at nightfall a few years ago. Over the decades, the pure white swans, seen from the lake-shore town of Trevignano Romano, had expanded into a flock of 25 or so, but never had we seen their black brethren. Sharp of eye and slightly frightening, they sported blood-red beaks with white tips. By comparison with the sturdy bodies of the white swans, the newcomers appeared thinner and agile enough to fly over fences. Whose fences? From where? We would never know. Well, the swans make their home on Lake Bracciano, which lies 25 miles or so north of Rome. For the ancient Romans, this was Lacus Sabatinus, named after the god Sabatius. From ancient Thrace, that's modern Bulgaria, the cult of Sabatius spread throughout Greece and then to the Roman Empire and all the way to Lake Bracciano, where he gave the name to the ancient Roman town of Sabate. And so this name survives in today's Anguillara Sabatia, one of the lake's 3 towns. So who was he? Well, like his Greek counterpart Dionysius and his Roman equivalent, who was called Bacchus, Sabatius represented wine and ritual ecstasy with a hint of madness and especially fertility. The upper-crust ancient Roman male had little use for this sort of thing. He honoured the more proper gods by strutting through town in show-off daytime processions. Covering his face, he would hold onto a stick, a wax effigy of an illustrious forebear. So, by contrast, the wider cults of Sabatius and Dionysius / Bacchus were celebrated by night by women and by slaves. Adorned in garlands worn of grape leaves and ivy, the women, in defiance of their husbands, would dance to the music of pipes and drums by torchlight in the fields. In the iconography of Sabatius, the phallus also made in toes. In short, Sabatius, also known as Dionysius / Bacchus, is a legendary delight. Where else can one feed the swans in a bacchanalian lake and then sip locally produced wines on its shore? The white swans, also, who thrive on the lake, have their own history. They were originally brought to Lake Bracciano in the 1940s by a Swiss couple, Hildegard and her husband Xavier Leutenegger. He was the personnel director of the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, the FAO, in Rome. While weekending on Lake Bracciano, their boat capsized, and for 7 hours they clung to its hull until the current carried them to the shore of the town of Anguillara. There, fishermen rescued them and took them home and put them to bed. The result was their falling in love with the area and its people, and they bought a home at the lakeside. It so happened that Hildegard was born on the Swiss-German border by Lake Constance, which was considered overpopulated with swans. From that lake, she was offered a pair of Lake Constance swans free of charge. On the way into Italy, passing the customs point, the guards let them wander free for a few moments and even fed them. Leutenegger, by then in her 90s, told me as we sat in her house and gazed out over the lake, so I put them in the lake. But guess what happened? The fishermen feared they would kill the fish, and the hunters came along and killed them for food. Their being considered a food was not entirely unusual, for swans had been a dining favourite of the Tudor English, including Queen Elizabeth I, who presented themselves at table, baked and decorated with their own feathers. Until fairly recently, they were still offered as a treat at British weddings. Well, distressed, Leutenegger had new swans brought the following year, only to have hunters kill these too. But she persisted year after year in bringing swans to Lake Bracciano, and eventually the local hunters grasped that however much the Tudors relished swan meat, it wasn't really all that tasty. Finally, the swans and Leutenegger prevailed. That's the story of the swans.
How did you find these things?
I knew her.
Tidbits.
She told me to.
Okay, should you go on to the next one?
Do you you want to read also, we can all take turns reading your book.
Oh, that's fine.
No, you're the you have to first.
This is about the archaeology and the archaeologists working underwater. Most unexpectedly, I found that I was living next door to the most important Neolithic village ever discovered in Western Europe. Only slightly younger than those in Switzerland, whose earliest village dates from 4000 BC, our lake village was larger. It was discovered underwater at a spot which I see every day from my house in the village. On the basis that no stone materials belonging to the lower and middle Paleolithic period have been yet found nearby, this makes the Lake Bracciano village the oldest sign of human life in the territory, according to archaeologist Ida Caruso. Well, that's not true, because there are all kinds of there's also Paleolithic stuff.
Oh,
in fact,
that's
Federico Fabrovich is the archaeologist who lives in Bracciano. During a lecture some time ago to his group in Trevignano, he told of his adventures in excavating underwater. The first was in 1989. Workmen dredging the lake bottom to lay pipes for a supplementary aqueduct to carry water into Rome had plowed through the mud layer lining the lake bottom, which was many meters below, and they pulled up pieces of ceramics that brought the work on the aqueduct to a halt, because the ceramic was obviously Neolithic. In Italy, all treasures from excavations of this type belong automatically to the state, but initially the Roman cultural authorities were not overly exercised. Archaeologist Maria Antonietta Fugazzola del Pino, at the time director of the Pigorini Museum of Prehistory and Ethnography in Rome, EUR, was summoned to analyze the findings. She was an expert on Italian prehistory, a widely published author, and had already excavated Bronze Age villages here, right near Trevignano. They were on stilts and submerged fairly deeply underwater as a result of the sudden and drastic rising of the lake level. One of these villages was at Vigna di Valle, near Anguillara, while the others were close to Trevignano, near Acquarella, Vigna Grande, and Vicarello. These villages were submerged because of the sudden rising of Lake Bracciano, perhaps caused by earthquake. This upsurge had occurred at various times. Indeed, in addition to the Bronze Age villages on stilt, foundations of submerged ancient Roman villas are actually partly visible near the lake shore just west of Trevignano, where thieves have had a joyride hunting ancient Roman artifacts. The location of the Marmotta village, as it is called, was important. In Italy, scholars say the process they call neolithicization, or adoption of the burgeoning imported agri-pastoral economy, i.e. raising crops as opposed to hunting and fishing, began in the Italian deep south at Puglia and Lucania in the 6th millennium BC. From there moved slowly up the peninsula. However, the settlers at La Marmotta were obviously far more advanced than any of the locals. They, in their fairly rich culture, had come from afar, in boats rowed inland all the way up into the Tyrrhenian seacoast, and then 2.2 miles up the river Arone, which goes from near Fiumicino into Lake Bracciano. What's interesting about this is that they must have been able to speak with somebody. Someone told them they were looking for water that was not salt water, because you can't irrigate crops with salt water. So somebody must have told them to go up the river, because otherwise in their boat that had come all the way from, basically from Greece, they could not have done so. So they knew where they were coming. Anyway, as you can see, I don't read well.
You read very well.
Very
You
well.
get the next
You read
one.
very well.
She knows more than I know.
You know, I am so impressed. I really am
It's such a
impressed.
fascinating story.
No, the whole
Okay.
Place is
Let's
fascinating.
continue.
Deanna should read
Let's
something.
continue the story. This is from a chapter called Poverty.
Yes.
Poverty.
Well, let me make a quick introduction to poverty. When the Borgias destroyed the fortress up here, the fortress was no longer important to the Orsini. The Orsini managed to keep their castle, they managed to keep their property. So they let this just fall apart. It was nothing, and so it became extremely, extremely poor, as this will show you. This village lapsed into poverty. And the lapse into poverty saved us. It's why the Borgo is still so beautiful. It's why there has not been this incredible growth of trash houses that they have at Borgo. The Borgias in the late 15th century.
When they destroyed the late 15th century.
And at that point, this village no longer mattered. The fort that they built was up at the top, as you know. It had central tower, 4 towers around it, and then it had 2 rows of walls, and then a wall coming down to the lake, and another wall coming down to the lake at the end of the Borgo with watchtowers. One watchtower has been washed away. One remains, and you can see, if you look for it, you can see it along the lake front. But the Borgo was inside. This is where the soldiers lived and the fishermen. Soldiers, fishermen, and farmers lived inside it. And the reason that it's still here is because it was called poverty. So poverty hurt the people, but it helped us.
Okay, following the destruction of the fortress from bombing by the Borgias, the powerful Orsini left the Lake territory, and Trevignano lapsed into the deepest poverty. No good works were carried out, no new houses were built. Hogs roamed the streets, rather as they do today. We've got wild boar in the garden. Hogs roamed the streets for the simple reason that no one had the money or the energy to build pigsties. Nevertheless, some advantages arrived. After the Orsini sold Trevignano to Baron Francesco del Grillo in October of 1693, remember the date, 1693, the Grillo family owned the town for a whole century. The Borgo owners normally left administrators to tend the store, but in a radical change, the Grillo became hands-on managers who, from time to time, actually occupied the handsome palazzo that they built in the Borgo, which is still in existence. Nearby, they also built the Church of the Holy Crucifix with an adjacent cemetery. They drained a swampy area which was converted into fertile fields. A Grillo heiress provided funds for a school for girls. However, their improvements in agriculture came at the expense of grazing, and hence were read as favoritism for farmers. This so enraged shepherds living in the Borgo that they appealed to the Pope for help, and they received it. Still very poor, the townspeople suffered more than usual in the late 18th century. In the August of 1791, its feudal administrators cruelly announced that the local Trevignanesi could no longer use the pastures or collect timber in the woodlands, even though they had enjoyed those rights most of the time since the year 1213. A sharp decrease in population showed the extent of the poverty. The very first door-to-door head count ever made in Trevignano took place on orders from the church in Rome in 1768, first census.
Wow.
What would become an annual census, compiled in Latin every Easter by the parish priest, who is called Father Giuseppe Berti, and was called the Liber Status Animarum Curae Archi Presbyterialis Terrae Treboniani, or the Book of the Souls tended by the Archpresbytery of Trevignano lands. Father Berti's second cousin, which is rather complicated, in 1775 showed that some 400,000 inhabitants, representing 84 different families, lived in the Borgo. So 400 inhabitants, representing 84 families lived in the Borgo, while another 11 lived in the outskirts, which included Vicarello. 39 Borgo dwellers were identified as immigrants or paid seasonal workers, mostly from the Marche on the Adriatic coast. In his report, Father Berti called them mercenaries, mercenari qui in hoc territorio laborant. But then, a generation later, the population once more declined. Blamed for this was in part a particularly cruel baron, who in 1791 had forbidden the residents to pasture their flocks or to gather fowl. Such was the suffering during that time, the town population shrank from 366 residents, representing 96 families, to 243, with only 73 families. Do you want me to read it again? Such was the suffering during that time that the town population shrank from 366, representing 96 families, to 243, with only 73 families.
And this was in 1790 something, right?
1791. By the Easter of 1802, as a result, the head count showed a further decline in population to just 249. All but 15 of the same 73 surviving families lived inside the mortuary. According to the Trevignano historian Orfelio Maciucchi,
The father of Claudia the mayor.
Oh, right.
Who is the town historian. In fact, it's all stolen from him.
From the father of Claudia.
Father of Claudia. He was the local
He
historian.
loved the town.
According to him, conditions were so miserable that a number of young farmers left to seek greener fields, some as soldiers or conscripts in the war against Napoleon. When the French invasion succeeded, however, Napoleon's troops occupied here, Papal territory. This included Trevignano, which became a French outpost and was handed over to the French Duke of Chablis, whose Italian wife was called Mariana di Savoia.
And that brings us to wartime. Just a few pages very short about World War II. In 1936, Italy joined an axis with Nazi Germany, and in 1940 entered the Second World War on that side. That June, Italian forces occupied Britain's East African colonies in Eritrea, Somalia, and Ethiopia. On June 2nd that same year, the Trevignano youth were mobilized. Once again, 1/3 of the town population was conscripted, just the same as in World War I. Local accounts have it that until their retreat began, most of the German troops still in the area behaved, by and large, in a friendly way. Because Trevignano was relatively unimportant, the importance of being unimportant, and there was no nearby partisan activity, the German troops appeared relaxed and relieved that there was no nearby partisan activity. Despite the stress of war, they enjoyed time on the beach. According to architect Franco Mezzetti, writing in Trevignano Romano in 1969, the Trevignano population adapted to the new regime, closing itself into a calm and detached serenity, all given over to work in the fields and the shops. No episodes of violence on the part of the black shirts took place in Trevignano, just as there were no active manifestations of anti-fascism on the part of the citizens. Perhaps, I say. But nevertheless, as Maciucchi records, weapons of war were hidden in the olive orchards, including perhaps our own. The SS command was headquartered in a building in Bracciano. In Trevignano itself, the Nazi officers settled into a gracious 1920s villa overlooking the lake. In front of it was a small stone cottage, which the Nazis used for storing munitions. As a man who had been a child at the time told me, these munitions were brought in by plane and then across the lake by boat, and from Trevignano forward to Germans occupying the town's inland. During the war, Nazi troops also, that little cottage you see along the lake, it's the adorable little cottage, and behind it there's a nice villa. That was what the munitions were stored in the little cottage in front. I should put in the address. During the war, Nazi troops also occupied Vicarella, that gigantic estate with hot springs that had once belonged to Roman emperors. In the 1930s, on orders from the West German Rhineland, the male monks of the German-Hungarian College who were running the estate turned it over to the German nuns of Our Lady of Mulhausen. The 19th century hospice there was converted into a hospital for wounded German soldiers, tended by the German nuns.
Inside Vicarello.
Yeah, the Vicarelli big building.
Yeah.
Which was a sort of resort place in the 18th century for people who were sick. two of the Vicariella nuns were Italians, Sister Maria Sebalda and Sister Maria Lucrezia. And they had been dispatched to Trevignano as teachers in the little school that had been created and donated by the man still known as the Prince of Trevignano, Tuscan-born Piero Ginori Conti. Conti's a free name here. Who died in 1939. When a German patrol captured 5 men from Trevignano who had been hiding, they ordered them to be shot. Learning of the 5 arrested Trevignanesi, Sister Sebalda, who was already especially popular among the Trevignanesi, intervened to negotiate their release. The 5 were spared. Anyway, it's a mixed bag.
How did you collect all these?
Well, a lot came from Machuki. Certainly a lot. Machuki collected a lot.
This is the father of Claudia.
The father of Claudia. He was a passionate historian of Trevignano. He has put together more than anybody else.
Well, Judith, don't sound like so
If you
short.
look
You
in
did
the,
a huge amount of
if you look in the book,
research.
you'll see the source
It was
material.
fun, you know.
Yeah, don't tell you're so short.
It
This
didn't
must
do
have
nearly
been-
enough. Their mistake, terrible mistake.
Well, no. Come on.
Can I tell you
mean,
this
I
is-
will
I
just
mean, I haven't read it,
say,
but
I was so excited when this came up because when I, right when I bought my house here, the same as I did when I moved to Via del Moro in Rome, I went on a fanatic research hunt on the internet for everything I could find. So I really looked for materials on Trevignano. I found some interesting things.
Not
I
much.
found
Not
the
very
main,
much.
Not much.
right.
very much.
I found like one Google
That's right.
page where actually the Nathansons are mentioned because of a New York Times reporter who got sick and spent time in their home.
Who did?
Well,
New
our
York
friend,
Times
our friend,
reporter.
yeah, our friend.
And so
His
there's
wife,
a book
his wife, yeah,
where
I know.
they
Yeah,
mention that.
Yeah. They're
and,
friends.
but you can't find a lot. And
Well,
so to
it's
have-
all there.
Exactly. So I'm
This is
so
it.
excited.
This is the
Thank you so
definitive.
much.
This is the
And
definitive
so
work.
I'm well aware of how little there is out there.
Thank you.
So, and I purposely haven't started reading it because I wanted to save
Okay,
it for
well, when you
today.
come to the name of the main piazza here, I put the wrong name.
Okay.
Okay.
I remember.
Doesn't matter.
I put Vittorio Emanuele Terzo because I thought it was Secondo and Terzo.
What we want
The
to do
third one
now
was
is to get it translated into and published in Italian.
Oh my gosh, there's plenty of people who.
How do we do
Do you
that?
know who does translations? I don't know how. You know the niece of the Etruscologo Pallottino, Silvia Pallottino. She lives in Old. There's plenty of people who do translations.
Yes, we have.
I don't know.
I thought
They
you
had
said
their-
your publisher
they-
was going
Oh,
to
you
find
were
something.
No,
She
they
needs a
have
publisher.
offered
Who's
me.
going to
I need a publisher. I need a publisher. And it seems there's a translator's willing to do it for a musical charity.
So David, a good friend of mine in Rome was the companion of a man you knew who's passed away. Massimo, he was the number 2 person at RAI for many years. I can't remember his last name.
Anyway,
But
so I
Kay is
use
British and she does all the translations for Netflix
for
between
Netflix.
Italian and English. And so she might be a
Into,
possibility.
she's Italian though.
There-
We must find an
She's
Italian.
British.
But there
She
is
does
an
both
Italian-
ways.
There is all, I think that I had a meeting last night through Claudia, the mayor, and there is an offer for a translator, which would be crowdfunded and all that. The problem is to find a publisher who has the money to
Crowdfund for that too?
Well, they proposed it to me yesterday.
No, crowdfund for the publisher as well. I mean,
Well, we have to find a publisher. The problem is,
Do you know the woman who writes books about Etruscologo? She lives in Vetralla. What's her? Mary Jane?
yeah, I know.
Who does she use? Who does she use?
No idea. I think she's self-published.
She does it herself.
She's self-published.
I think she's self-published.
Well, they proposed that to me and I said no.
What Judy wants to avoid getting involved in a commercial operation. She wants to find somebody who will, a real publisher who can distribute the books and.
Yeah.
Well, maybe there are a couple of people who have recently published books at John Cabot, Elizabeth Gagan and Carlos Duz in the
Carlos
last
Duz,
month
wow.
have published.
Yeah, well, they proposed it to me yesterday, and I got, today's publishing. Look at the book. There are a lot of photographs. The quality of the paper is fine. They don't do that here.
What is amazing?
This is new technology.
Where did you get this printed?
In English. This is new technology.
But you
Brand
see,
new.
Listen,
The
if you-
layout.
I don't know whether you, I'm not a publisher, I'm just
I know nothing.
This is a new world.
I spoke to the publisher the other day. Yeah,
I wish you'd sit down. Why don't you sit down?
until this year, till recently, till last year, to publish a book like this was terribly
Would have been
expensive.
impossible.
Because you had to get lithographs of all the things. You remember how they put all the photographs into sections in the middle of the book.
That's right. And including my own last book. That last two or three books.
All got pictures.
In the,
I
in
thought,
the central
listen,
section.
as recently as
This is new.
Now they use
recently
the
as 4 years
espresso
ago,
machines, they're called.
Is that what it's called?
In America, yeah, there are two big
published
companies.
a new
Listen.
In America, there are two big companies that do prints like this. So, for example, at the New York Public Library now, you can actually, the library publishes, they used to publish like, hardback books through Oxford University Press. Now they publish books like this, and they purchase one of the two machines that it's possible to use. And one is the espresso machine, coincidentally. And the espresso machine can print something like this, each copy, I would say, in about 45 minutes. But the machine itself costs about $30,000.
And it doesn't exist here where the people that I've been talking to, they've never even heard of it. They don't have it.
No, just a minute though. Let me on the technological side.
Yes, sir.
I have something to contribute.
Okay.
The technology. This is called POD, print on
Print on demand,
Okay,
exactly.
right.
About it.
One
I had
second.
heard of it
One
yesterday.
second. 1 second. POD. Okay, POD. What does POD mean? POD means that if you have a properly formatted book, that is to say, you've got a Word file with the whole. As you know, you can put the whole book on Kindle
Exactly.
in 1 second.
In like one,
In
yeah,
1
right,
second,
right.
you can put it on there. Okay. If you've got the thing correctly formatted in a Word file, you don't even need one of these £30,000 machines. You can take it round the corner to the printer here in the piazza,
Right.
and he presses a button, and he will make you a copy of your book for.
He did. They
He
did.
made copies
They
of
did
this
make
book.
before this came out. I had copies
Well, how
made
many?
just for
How
myself.
many?
So I had
have
five copies made.
But
Just,
anyway,
just to
in
have this
colour,
for
in
myself.
colour,
In color.
which is
Beautiful.
almost
Well, that's beautiful.
indistinguishable.
That's how every university student, I mean, every doctoral student publishes their
I
thesis
just take
now.
it. I just take it on a little stick, and they stick it in, and
I
now
would like a autograph.
signature.
Can I ask a
Dedication.
favor? Can we just read a little from the beginning, or from after the swans? Only
Read my
because
day.
I've been putting off reading it for today.
Okay, well
And
read
I'm
it,
just
read
so
a bit,
excited.
read a bit,
Well,
read a bit.
Okay, should I start with ghosts?
Yeah, start with ghosts.
Because we did swans.
Tell us where you are.
We're having a reading. If you want to join us.
Come.
You didn't tell me I've got stuff.
You know why I didn't tell you is because unless
We
I don't
can be
report
maximum 6.
No, please come. Please come.
My shopping.
So what? It's not going to go bad.
I'll
Come
move
on, I love
by the
you.
dog.
Another chair.
I'll move by the dog.
Ayla, there's a crostata also after the reading.
That's just what we need.
Oh, come on. First of all, I forgot. But second of all, I forgot because I was told not to invite anybody.
No, you're quite right. It's just she told me all about it. Why didn't you invite me?
I forgot. I really did.
Come and sit here.
Next to you, dear.
Come with me.
Okay. So ghosts,
Oh,
you're
you
going to
missed
start
my,
ghosts?
you missed my beautiful voice.
Yeah, should I do ghosts?
Yeah, do ghosts.
Yes.
You do ghosts.
Ghosts. Measure it 100 times and life is always the same old size. Racciano proverb. I am no stranger to the joys and hazards of lake water, albeit in a far different way, during my early childhood life in Cleveland, Ohio. Growing up in the far western suburb of Bay Village, we lived close enough to the lake that on a stormy night I could hear the angry roar of the waves of Lake Erie as they punched against the cliffs of the shoreline. By daytime, when the lake froze, as it did regularly, Visible in the far distance would be a feisty icebreaker, forging a channel for one of the giant freighters that plied all 5 Great Lakes, no matter what the weather. Since even before the Civil War, Lake Erie had been the port of call for boats delivering the iron ore mined above Lake Superior. During the mid-19th century winters, that ore was occasionally delivered by sleigh. A century later, Cleveland had 20 steel and rolling mills and blast furnaces clustered around the broad valley of the winding Cuyahoga River. There, the iron ore arriving from the north met and married the coal delivered by train from the pits of southern Ohio and Pennsylvania. This was steel manufacture at its most rewarding, for its mills supplied the wherewithal for the railroad tracks, not to mention the locomotives that first helped to win the Civil War, then laid the tracks for the trek westward all the way to California. Not surprisingly, the pollution level caused by the manufacture of tracks and trains, and later of washing machines and dishwashers, was devastating. In the years after the Second World War, many parents forbade their children to swim in the lake. So acute was the pollution near the mouth of the Cuyahoga, where it flowed into Lake Erie, that the river actually caught fire in the summer of 1952, when 2 bridges burned down and repairs cost $100,000. By the time a similar fire occurred on June 22, 1969, it caused so little commotion that the Washington Post wrote cynically the next day, "Flare-ups on the river are so common that this particular fire, which was extinguished in half an hour and did relatively little damage, barely made headlines in the local papers." My years as an undergraduate at Northwestern University were little different. Chicago pollution was no laughing matter. Lake Michigan washed up against the shoreline of the sprawling university campus, and in the 10-minute slog between lecture halls, we would be half blown apart from the wind-driven snow rushing across the icy surface of the lake. Life was better in summer, but the Great Lakes season is madly brief, brisk, and breezy. It was a thrill to discover that, by contrast, the Mediterranean summer dawdles along. From mid-May, it is a careless, sultry maiden sending rose petals adrift to perfume the air. This endures into early October, when mildew traces on the grapes in the misty low fields, where mildew traces on the grapes in the misty low fields make them precious to the wine harvesters. Like that wine, the Roman summer is to be savored. One must revel in it, let it seep into the soul. I did not invent this love of the Italian summer, needless to say. The Turanian seacoast lies barely a half hour from where I write. Passing on the coastal road on the way to Rome, Charles Dickens was bowled over by, quote, "the gardens of the bright villages along the road, all blushing in the summertime with clusters of the belladonna," end quote. Belladonna, a lily that I now grow in a pot on my terrace overlooking Lake Braccio. At every time of day and every season, our lake is picture pretty. Ours, in my mind at least, now that I have had a house overlooking the lake for over a quarter century. In the mornings, the blue waters are usually calm, especially in summer, while becoming lively and chirpy in the afternoons when the wind normally rises and clusters of sailboats from the 7 scattered sailing schools make their appearance. A particularly rainy springtime 2 years ago brought a savage storm that damaged a road on the Trevignano waterfront and literally wrecked a small bridge. The water level in the lake rose unexpectedly higher than in many years, infuriating the managers who rent summer beach umbrellas and deck chairs, for they found themselves with almost no beach, if only briefly. At another time, while walking out in a light but chilly drizzle one day with our big dog Bella,
you're famous.
a sort of English pointer, I was appalled.
Bella's blushing. Bella's blushing. Oh, poor Bella.
I was appalled at the sight of first a few and then dozens of dead fish on the shore. They seemed huge to me. Many were 2 feet and others over 3 feet long. As I tried to keep Bella from excitedly jumping upon the stinking dead carcasses, one of the local fishermen remarked grimly, "Carp, bottom feeders, never seen anything like it." One of the grimmer sights was of a carp at least a yard long, still gasping as it lay dying on the gray-black volcanic sand at the edge of the lake. Obviously, he could not live long. Nearby, a cluster of village men stood gaping. "How sad," I exclaimed, "whatever is killing all those fish?" By then, I had seen at least 30 dead. "Copulation," said one, nodding wisely. "What? Do you mean reproduction?" I asked, incredulous. "Sure. A biologist tested them and said it was stress after they'd mated." Wore them out. It did.
I think this is a dirty book.
It is. He shook his head wearily, intimating that sexual relations were a heavy weather duty which only the hardiest of the male species could fulfill. "Really? My goodness," I said. Then, starchy as a Victorian schoolmarm, I resumed my walk until, pausing after a mile or so, I recognized a familiar foursome of men who fished in the same spot most mornings. "I just saw some giant carp dying," I told them, breathless with concern. Curiosity trumping starchiness, I added, "The men on the beach looking at them told me they died from stress from, reproduction." A fisherman burst into sardonic laughter. "And you believe that?" he said. "Well, no. Personally, I'm too old to remember that particular stress," another joked. Okay, I think that's a nice racing place to...
Yeah, that's a start.
That is so cool.
This is great, Judith.
That is great.
There's history and humor and lovely anecdotes, and it's personal.
And sex.
And it's beautifully,
Sex.
Beautifully written too.
very beautifully written. Nice.
Oh, it's wonderful. Okay, Danette.
Danette, ¿a dónde? Where do you want me to start? Wait, Jared isn't this that before you leave?
Oh, I'll take it with me, yeah.
Sorry, I have to. I will. Find a place. Find a place.
Oh, I'm sure it will.
If you do, let me know.
Lila, Saturday, 30, we're going to try to congregate
Okay.
here, but Anna said that if there's too many, they're just going to kick us out.
No, you let me. What?
No, you just show up.
Okay. Okay, we know. No, because then I'll bring my reading glasses too.
So, it says on the next page, aw, it says on the next page that you moved to downtown Rome in the 60s. Where was that when you moved to downtown Rome in the 60s?
Well, yeah, no, you told me all about it.
Well, I moved into Trastevere.
Oh, in Trastevere. Where exactly?
Are you listening to us talking, my dear?
Uh-huh.
The cake. This is the cake. Yes, I know.
Nunez was a very wealthy Jewish family in Rome.
You only come for the cake. You get it.
I don't want to leave. That's why she has to leave.
I know, she's great.
I love it. Thank you. Did you like the pear? Pear and chocolate one? That's a nice one. My goodness.
I didn't, yes, I love this. I didn't know that Bella is going to figure in the reading.
Well, what's that?
Well, I'm going to read something
It's
in
not,
this.
it's not every dog who gets a
Certainly not.
Judy, would you like to
public acclaim.
David, have you seen the exhibition of the Colonia that you had told me about before it happened?
the Marmi?
Stop.
The
We
Marmi de
we went to see it on Tuesday last week. It is unbelievable. I'm writing about it. We're both writing about it. We've got the catalogue, which is very interesting.
vuoi fare tutto?
This week, but I didn't have time to go, and I'm very
No, it's
sorry.
closed now.
Oh.
It will reopen when they.
Oh yeah, all the museums are closed, right? Of
We
course.
had a special.
This is so beautiful. The two of you with the dog.
Can you imagine? We had the exhibition to us.
I'm about to give you a piece, but I dropped the knife, so I'm going to wash the
And you
knife
can
and
see
then.
many of them in their
loose form.
Yeah, but you know,
I had seen
no, I have this, but I have to. She wants me to continue to film it. This is for you with that.
I didn't.
So last week I made. Grazie.
They were just higgledy-piggledy in a
So last
store
week
in
I
a store.
made pear and chocolate.
When they closed the exhibition in 1939, they just took them out of, no, they just piled them up in a storeroom
And I will read.
Wow.
and locked the door. And they've been forgotten for 80 years.
Yeah, that's what I'm. But so it's worth going to. Yeah.
It's astonishing. They are,
Astonishing.
and they've only got, yeah,
The
and they've only got,
Oh, please do, please do.
Sorry.
So hard, our 3 days of work on this.
Hanno te? Sì. Te lo do un pezzo?
Me? This is very difficult.
Okay. I'm going to say if we introduce ourselves, we can close this off. So Deanna, why don't you start introducing yourself?
In italiano o inglese?
Inglese.
Whatever. Tutti e due?
Certo.
Okay. Hello, my name is Deanna Lee. I have been a Trevignanese for actually about exactly 1 year now. And I spend most of my time here, and occasionally I go back into Rome. I came to Italy as a visiting writing fellow at the American Academy in Rome, and after my year I loved it so much I stayed. E allora mi chiamo Deanna Lee e sono un trevignanese da novembre dell'anno scorso, allora è stato 1 anno che sono qui. Ho anche una piccola casa a Roma, ma più o meno sempre sto qui perché sono innamorata con Trevignano. Sono arrivata in Italia 4 anni fa all'Accademia Americana di Roma per scrivere, e dopo 1 anno del borsa di studio non volevo partire, allora eccomi.
Capita.
Io sono un giornalista.
Finish chewing before you talk.
No,
It's okay.
alla BBC, ho lavorato per 50 anni quasi per la BBC come corrispondenti, come inviato speciale. Ho viaggiato in molti paesi, in molte parti del Londra, ho vissuto in Africa e in Oriente e finalmente sono arrivato a Trevignano 30 anni fa perché avevamo una casa a Roma e facevamo il pendolare tra Roma e Trevignano e venivamo qui ogni weekend. E poi finalmente 10 anni fa, abbiamo deciso di chiudere a Roma e venire a lavorare e vivere a Trevignano perché era facile di accesso a Roma, e poi io ho la grande fortuna di essere un lavoratore remoto, cioè utilizzo da molti anni remote communications. Allora io faccio per esempio trasmissioni internazionali da una piccola studio qui a Trevignano e nessuno sa dove sto. Va bene. E poi che cosa vuol sapere altro?
Se non è complicato, io lo tradurrei in inglese se non ha problemi di lingua. Potrebbe tradurlo in inglese, altrimenti lo faccio io, ma verrà sicuramente meglio.
Okay.
Indicando anche il suo nome.
Sì. My name's David Willey, and I'm very proud to be an inhabitant of Trevignano Romano. I've lived here for about on and off for about 30 years, and it's a wonderful place. It's very near to Rome. Funnily enough, it reminds me of the city where I was born and grew up in England. I was born and brought up and educated in a small town on the River Thames, about 35 miles from London, exactly just like Trevignano with its lake is 35 miles from Rome.
and so the water was a great attraction. I loved walking by the River Thames when I was a kid, and it reminds me in many ways of what I knew as a child in England, although it's very different, and the climate is somewhat different as well. So the Trevignano has become home for Judy and myself. We've become adoptive citizens of this small and beautiful place, and got to know many of the inhabitants. And Judy has written this book about Trevignano, which is the first major work in English about Trevignano, which is now published in England, and she's getting it translated and published in Italian. Fra poco, speriamo. So that's our story.
Hello, I'm Judith Harris, and I worked in Italy for RAI, and I had a radio program of my own. And in the year 2000, I resigned because I wanted to concentrate on cultural preservation, on preserving and encouraging people to enjoy and want to preserve the Italian cultural heritage, which at that time was very neglected. So I wrote a book about Pompeii, which was fairly successful. I lectured about it from San Francisco to Indonesia, and then I wrote a book about Venice, and now this on Trevignano.
Translate, please.
I beg your pardon?
Italiano.
Io sono venuta in Italia tanti anni fa, decenni anni fa, come funzionario del governo americano, ero diplomatica. E poi, dopo la guerra nel Vietnam, avevo difficoltà a sostenerlo, e allora, perché facevo relazioni pubbliche per l'ambasciata americana, e non era facile. Allora mi sono dimessa e sono entrata in giornalismo qui, ho lavorato per Time Magazine, NBC News ed altri. Ho scritto per Washington Post, per molti giornali. E poi mi sono messa a scrivere libri. Io lavoravo anche per la RAI, con una rubrica culturale. E poi adesso scrivo libri, questo è il quarto libro mio.
Grazie.
Grazie a te.
Bella.
E questa è Bella la Trovatella.
È molto riservata, Bella.
È molto gentile.
Bella,
Non dà mai fastidio.
Allora, io mi chiamo Danette Anderson e sono a Trevignano come residente parziale un po' di tempo, da 15 anni. Sono innamorata di questo posto, mi sono innamorata di Trevignano 30 anni fa, quando portavo i miei figli qui al lago. E io ho sempre lavorato negli ambienti accademici in tutto il mondo, ho vissuto anche io in Africa, in Asia, ho sempre girato senza mai sentirmi a casa da nessuna parte, mentre Trevignano è il posto dove mi sento a casa, anche se non sto sempre qui. Questo è il posto dove il mio corpo, la mia anima è felicissima, e ringrazio questo posto magnifico, magico, che spero rimanga un segreto. So my name is Danette Anderson. I am half Italian, half American. I was raised in Africa, in Ethiopia and Eritrea. Have lived in the Middle East, in Bahrain, and lived in England and France, and traveled. I still travel for work, but every time I come to Trevignano, my soul is at peace, and I rest, and I just love being here. I've had a house here for 15 years, but I've been part of Trevignano for 30, and I do hope that I can continue to spend as much time as possible in this enchanted village.
Thank you.
very nice.
Would you like another piece?
I would love it, but I'm going to say no.
Don't worry, I bake all the time. So, ti do un pezzo? Certo.
I have a very. Could you cut me a small piece? No, it's too good to be true. No, but listen. So you were brought up in Ethiopia.
My mother,
What
when
were
you
you?
said that, my mother,
Ethiopia.
my mother,
Yes.
Eccomi qui, io sono Anna, questa è Trevignano.
this place
e stiamo per concludere questo incontro, questo primo incontro del sabato pomeriggio. Molto contenta di aver organizzato questa cosa, ringrazio i miei ospiti. Spazio in itinere, Borgo Trevignano. Ciao!